The transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in world history, was fueled by European colonial powers competing to exploit the labor of African people for profit. Among these nations was Denmark, a lesser-known but important player in this system of exploitation. Though Denmark's participation in the transatlantic slave trade was smaller than that of countries like Britain or Portugal, it had a significant and lasting impact on the regions involved. Today, we will explore Denmark's role in the slave trade, the origins of Danish involvement, the economic and human costs, and its legacy that continues to resonate today. The Danish involvement in the transatlantic slave trade began in the early 17th century, during a period of increasing European colonial competition. While Denmark was not initially a leading maritime power like Spain, Portugal, or Britain, it soon made its mark in the Atlantic world, particularly with the establishment of Danish colonies in the West Indies and along the African coast. In 1671, Denmark established its first significant colonial possession in the Caribbean, the island of St. Thomas. Soon after, Denmark expanded to St. John in 1718 and St. Croix in 1733, areas that would later become the heart of Denmark's colonial empire in the Americas. Denmark also began trading on the coast of West Africa, primarily in modern-day Ghana, where it established forts to facilitate the purchase and transport of enslaved Africans. The key organization responsible for managing Denmark's colonial and slave trading operations was the Danish West India and Guinea Company, or DWIG, founded in 1671. The company was created to oversee Denmark's economic interests in the Caribbean and West Africa. Its dual role as a trading and colonizing institution meant that it was directly involved in the acquisition of enslaved people, their transportation, and their labor exploitation in the New World. The DWIG was granted the monopoly over Danish colonial trade, and it quickly became involved in the trafficking of enslaved Africans to the Caribbean plantations, which produced sugar, tobacco, and other lucrative crops. The company's profits were closely tied to the labor of enslaved people. It was estimated that by the mid-18th century, Denmark had shipped thousands of enslaved Africans to its Caribbean colonies, where they were forced to work under brutal conditions. Although Denmark's slave trade was small compared to other European powers, its impact was significant in the Caribbean. At its height, Denmark's colonies in the West Indies, particularly St. Croix, became key producers of sugar, one of the most profitable commodities in the Atlantic world. Enslaved Africans were the backbone of the sugar economy, and it is estimated that between 1671 and 1803, around 100,000 enslaved Africans were transported to the Danish Caribbean colonies. Denmark's active participation in the slave trade led to the growth of a plantation system that relied heavily on forced labor. In total, Denmark's slave trade transported approximately 100,000 Africans to the Americas. While the Danish slave trade was much smaller than that of Britain, France, or Spain, its involvement had lasting effects on the demographic and social landscape of the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, enslaved Africans faced harsh and grueling conditions. On plantations in St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John, they were forced to labor under brutal conditions in the sugar fields. The violence and exploitation of enslaved individuals were systematic and deeply ingrained in the colonial economy. In the Danish colonies, the enslaved population outnumbered the European settlers, with enslaved Africans making up as much as 90% of the population in some areas. This imbalance led to tensions, which, combined with the grueling conditions, fueled resistance movements. Enslaved individuals attempted to fight back against their captors in various ways, through rebellion, escape, and everyday acts of resistance. As the 18th century drew to a close, European sentiments began shifting. The abolitionist movement, which had gained traction in Britain, France, and other countries, started to reach Denmark. By the early 19th century, the moral and economic arguments against the slave trade grew stronger. In 1792, Denmark became the first European country to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, passing legislation that prohibited the trade of enslaved people. However, slavery itself remained legal in Danish territories until 1848, when Denmark finally abolished slavery entirely in the Danish West Indies. Despite the abolition of the trade, the legacy of slavery continued to shape the Danish colonies and the Caribbean. Denmark's economy, particularly in the Caribbean, had been built on the exploitation of enslaved labor, and the long-term consequences of that system would continue to affect the lives of many people for generations. The legacy of Denmark's involvement in the slave trade has had profound social, economic, and cultural consequences. In Denmark, the historical memory of the country's colonial past has long been overlooked. But in recent years, there has been a growing acknowledgement of this dark chapter. Many of the descendants of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean still live in the former Danish colonies today, and their history is integral to understanding the lasting impact of Denmark's role in the transatlantic slave trade. In recent years, Denmark has taken steps toward reconciliation. In 2021, the Danish government announced plans to fund research and education on the country's colonial history. The Danish royal family also issued apologies for their historical role in the slave trade, acknowledging the need to confront the past.